There once lived a boy who loved trains. He was absolutely obsessed with them. Everything he owned related to trains. He had multiple 100-piece train sets. He had mechanical, electronic, steam-powered, water-powered, nuclear-powered, every sort of train he could imagine. At only the age of 5, he had already purchased, with his parents' money of course, a dozen books on the subject, and he jumped with glee any time he learned a new train fact. He would constantly ask his parents to see the trains down by the road next to the stream by the salon. Every time they went, the largest grin stretched across his pale, freckled face. All in all, trains were his absolute most favorite thing in the world, even from a very young age. Eventually, Timmy, at least that's what his parents called him, started elementary school. Ecstatic to make new friends and talk about trains, he ran through the doors while screeching in excitement to meet his classmates. On the very first day, Timmy brought 3 of his best trains with him in his train-shaped backpack. This backpack equipped itself with a real-life choo-choo whistle, 6 different compartments for train paraphernalia, and a glossy varnish to attract the eyes of anyone nearby. He also had named his trains Trainee, Mr. Choo-Choo, and Steve. The other kids didn't care too much for his hobby, nor were they nearly as excited about the automobiles he brought, but Timmy didn't care. He enjoyed them despite the lack of external attention received. A few years passed, and his passion failed to recede even the slightest. He dressed as a train every Halloween, read up on the history, technology, and trafficking of trains constantly, and when it finally came time to look for schools, he decided that UT Austin, University of Trains in Austin, seemed perfect for him. He spent months filling out his application, tweaking and working each minuscule detail until he obtained perfection. Editing each word in the essay, checking all his scores again and again and again, working through exhausting days and feverish nights. Finally, with an anxious, shaky hand, he pressed submit, sending his application to the tantalizing Office of Admissions. Months droned by without a response, but finally, on April 13th, Timmy, now going by the more mature Tim, had received an email. When he finally mustered the confidence to open it, which took many minutes to acquire that level of courage, he let out a loud hoot as he read a congratulations on the first line. Thrilled, he ran downstairs to tell his parents the news. They were, to his knowledge, ecstatic. His college years aren't worth noting, mostly because he remembers none of them due to countless all-nighters filled with studying, binge drinking, or both. Nonetheless, he graduated with high honors and a specialty in train law. Now, with a degree in hand and a passion to pursue, he is ready to get out there to the real world and find a job. Tim was going to be a train conductor. Tim is from Missouri, and the rules for getting a train license in this state requires 2 steps, a written test and a driving test. The written test asks 100 questions, and the driving test conducts a random but fairly simple round. If he passes both, he succeeds. So he set up a test appointment for 6 months ahead, giving him plenty of time to train. Finally, the day came to take the test, and reasonably, Tim was very nervous. He would be able to retry if he fails, but only twice. In Missouri, if someone fails the test 3 times, they will never be able to drive a train. Ever. They will never be able to drive. No exceptions. Yes, this is what most English high school teachers will call foreshadowing. With high spirits and even higher expectations due to his decade-long love for trains, his hours upon days of studying, and his honest-to-God true passion for the subject, he eagerly and readily came to pass these tests. With great vitality, Timmy marched through the doors, announced his presence, picking up a sharp number 2 yellow HB pencil in order to begin writing the written test. Chapter 2. The clock ticked rhythmically as Tim, now over 60 questions in, still had over half his time remaining. Some of the questions had seemed pretty difficult, but nothing too intense for him. He felt confident in his answers, and again, he only needed a 70 to pass. He checked his work 3 times before submitting his marked-up paper to the proctor. He stood there pivoting, pacing, and pondering as the patient proctor punctually perused over each page. With a little flutter in his eyes and a small lift of his brow, the worker congratulated Timmy and told him he got 98 out of the 100 questions correct, one of the highest scores ever seen. Timmy, thrilled, but not terribly surprised as he had worked very hard for this achievement, genuinely believed he deserved this success, thanked the grader, and went on to his next task. Timmy then followed a long corridor of flickering lights and striped walls to the trains outside. Only one test to go, and he would be a conductor. He could feel his heart racing as they instructed him on the task. He had to drive along 3 railroads, from St. Louis to Philadelphia. Once he arrived there without any issues, he would receive his license. He asked if he would do this alone, and they said, of course, this is the train station, whatever that means. Must be a train thing. But Timmy climbed up the rugged metal stairs, studied the knobs and buttons a bit to get his bearings, and then he started the ignition. He began to shovel coal into the engine. With a loud clug, the train let out a dark puff of smoke, the wheels began to turn, and he could feel his heart race as the train started its movement. A wide grin appeared on his now much less pale, cold-stained face. He had waited for this moment his entire life. All he had to do was make it to Philadelphia. Easy enough, right? After a few hours of sailing across the plains of the Midwest, he had passed a sign welcoming him to Chicago. Everything seemed right. A few hours later, though, his confidence began to fade. He noticed a Tim Hortons along every street, along with scattered hockey sticks and overwhelming surplus of maple syrup ads. He mostly just shrugged these off with unease, but once he saw igloos and polar bears, he realized he must have made a terrible mistake. Devastated, he needed to admit defeat and call for help. As he called the station to find him on the radar, they were shocked to see he drove all the way to the North Pole somehow. They said that he definitely failed and that he should wait there until the crew retrieved him. They reminded him he could try again in 6 months, but he only had 2 tries left. Tim cried himself home that day as pebbles of tears dripped down his face, staining the leather of his 2006 Toyota Corolla. However, he would not be discouraged. This lifelong dream must be attained. He sat down and studied nearly nonstop for the next 6 months, eating nothing but ramen, Tootsie Pops, and dry oats. The rules and routes of the train became his life. Finally, when 6 grueling months passed, Timmy drove himself to the train station to try again, this time feeling far more prepared, but a little less confident. He strolled in a bit casually and sat down to take the test. He carefully answered each question, but he knew the material so well that he finished about 45 minutes early, even with checking his work. Eager to get back on the train, he turned the much cleaner paper in early, against his own advice. However, to his glee, he only missed one question, an obscure fact about the great train race of '48. Again, he walked down that long corridor and left the building to witness the same instructor. He told Tim that this time they would give him a little easier of a task, just drive from St. Louis to Chicago. He basically did this already, so he felt good this time. After shoveling coal into the furnace to begin his journey, he thought about his failure the first time. Unfortunately for Timmy, he got distracted in his own thoughts. He psyched himself out and made a few wrong turns. Next thing he knew, he saw the Pope talking in Vatican City. After a few minutes of heavy tears, he managed to call in and report his failure. They retrieved him and the train and told him he only gets one more chance. At least they followed with a good luck next time. The next 6 months peaked at the worst of his life. He had never worked so hard for something, but by the end he knew every railroad, every route, every button, every aspect of trains, front, back, sideways, upside down, and inside out. When he came back to take the written test, he got every single one right in half the time. He barely even looked up to think. Trains became his second nature. No, first nature. He now went by Thomas. This time, all he had to do was drive 3 hours, from St. Louis to the capital of his state, Jefferson City. He boarded the train and took off. It was one straight route. He could not fail. He stayed determined and focused. He stayed on the route the whole way, making sure to monitor his speed and never turn. But then, somehow, to this day, no one really understands how. But Thomas noticed in his peripheral a devastating sign. Welcome to Texas. Chapter 3. Something snapped in Thomas's mind that day. Maybe it was a lifetime of hope crushing from a distant road sign. Maybe it was the broken acceptance of defeat. Maybe pure exhaustion had taken control. Despite the reason rage filled his body, he really thought he would succeed. He thought he could, he thought he could, he thought he could. He could not lose this forever. Thomas could not fail. He refused to pick up the phone despite recognizing his failure. Instead, he furiously snatched the shovel from the ground, dug it deep into the pile of coal, and threw the entire stack into the furnace. With a loud burst of fiery smoke, he started the engine once more. The train accelerated, racing down the railroad as Thomas's heart raced in his chest. Piles upon piles of coal flew into the burning engine. The train sped faster and faster and faster. Citizens started to notice. A local town heard the rumbling of the tracks and wondered why it seemed louder than usual. He started to smell thick layers of smoke and felt discomfort as Thomas and the train approached. Eventually, he caught a loose rail and the train flew from the tracks. Nonetheless, the wheels kept turning and he kept shoveling. People ran for their lives as the train hurtled down the streets, destroying stores and cars and houses, and the train smashed through anything in sight. The police arrived and attempted to make a blockade, but that only resulted in further casualties as Thomas obliterated the wall of police. Not only did he do that, but he just kept going forward. Not until he busted through the facade of a local orphanage hospital for blind children. Resulting in 3 dead and 14 wounded, did the train come to a halt. Thomas, concussed and confused, felt the cold handcuffs wrap around his hands as the injured police carried him away. In trial, he received the highest punishment in the state of Texas, the death penalty. Months passed, sitting in a cold, damp, cluttered cell alone, with nothing but thoughts and failures, until the day came in which the officer asked Thomas for his last meal request. In a meek and shrill voice, he croaked, "I would like the largest steak you can find, and the largest Cuban cigar out there." The guard accepted his request and returned with a hunk of meat weighing in at 24 ounces, and a cigar over 6 inches long. Thomas swallowed the entire steak in one bite, grotesquely gulping the cutlet down his gullet. He finished it off with a long drag of the cigar, finishing that instantly as well. Mildly impressed, the guard smirked a bit, but remembering the crimes Thomas committed, that smirk faded as quickly as the cigar. 2 guards grabbed 1 arm each and walked the prisoner to the room where he would meet execution. The manner in which he chose, by popular request, was the electric chair. He had heard horror stories of lethal injections ending horribly, and supposedly had never seen the Green Mile. The officer sat him down, locked his arms to the chair, doused his head with a sponge. They asked if he had any last words after a spiel about rights and laws, and he just remained quiet until they condemned the executioner behind the cage to pull the switch. With a low, dull, clicking sound, the switch ignited the chair's electricity, causing Thomas to shake and throttle for about a dozen seconds. Finally, when the electricity stilled, his body felt weak. The doctor came over to check his pulse, a routine act and usually not necessary, but to each spectator's surprise, his heart still beat. He somehow, miraculously, stayed alive. By mandate of the prison, to remain, as they call it, humane, they must nurse the prisoner back to health before trying to kill him again. This may cause some to question who the real criminals are, but that's for a different story. After months of patching wounds, eating vile food, and feeling sorely disdained, Thomas grew healthy enough for his last meal. They asked what he wanted, and he responded that he wanted a steak 3 times the size of the last one and a cigar 4 times as long. Again, With surprising ease, he slurped down that chunk of meat with one single bite and sucked the entire cigar to ash with a long, single drag. The officers felt a sense of deja vu as they brought him back to the room with the chair. To really make sure it would work this time, they allocated 95% of the prison's electricity just for Thomas. He still had no words. They pulled the switch, and this time he shook far more violently. His head vibrated back and forth, and his fingers started to glow. Nearly almost all his hair burned from his scalp, and when he once again fell limp, as the electricity ceased, he lay smoking. Surely he couldn't still be alive, but out of custom, the doctor nervously walked over to feel for a pulse. He waited a few minutes, of course, as to not burn himself. Finally, the doctor meandered over, wrapped his hand around Thomas's singed wrist, placing 2 fingers on the arteries under his hand. And after 2 minutes of checking and checking again to be absolutely sure he wasn't just feeling things, he meekly announced that a pulse still remained. After further deliberation, they realized they had to nurse him back to health again. Shocked and annoyed, they carried his unconscious body back to his cell, where he would remain in great agony for the next 3 years until they finally came back and once again asked about a last meal. This time he requested a steak 6 times bigger and a cigar 7 times longer. Again, he swallowed and smoked them in one hit. The guards weren't even surprised this time. They ceased to care. By state order, they somehow allocated all the electricity in the state of Texas solely for his execution. Thomas had no feeling about this. Most of his feelings dissipated anyway. Still, no words spoken when prompted. They pulled the switch more anxious than ever. Everyone watching sat behind multiple layers of glass and insulation for protection, as no one knew what would happen. Thomas's stoic and quiet body began to shake. The vibration only grew as the seconds ticked on. His hands jerked through the air. His remaining hair burst into flames. Not a single scream emitted audibly from his mouth, but the entire display appalled the spectators so horrifically, no one can fully describe it, simply using words. However, he eventually stopped trembling, and the doctor went to check one last time for a pulse. The doctor retired that day. After realizing Thomas remained too much of a liability, and in reality cost the prison too much, they realized he isn't worth it anymore. He can't cause more harm, and he can't really accomplish anything at this point. So they chose to just release his crippled, burnt, exhausted body into the wild of free life. They did give him a 40% off coupon for healthcare, so he does get to recover somewhat. Of course, the recovery stayed slow and arduous. Most of his vocal cords charred. He could never fully grow back his hair, and he had 3rd-degree burns all over his body. After decades, though, years of painful hospital visits, and ineffective medication, he eventually returned to a mildly livable life. At least, he could finally walk on his own. At the age of 73, he went to the grocery store to pick up the only food he could eat, Jell-O and mashed potatoes, when someone recognized him. It was one of his old guards, the one who saw him swallow over 10 pounds of steak in one bite. He confirmed it truly was Thomas, and please tell me, how did you possibly survive all the electricity? How are you still alive? Thomas stood for a bit. He thought about his answer. He thought about his lifetime of disappointment and failure, how he once had a passion, only to see that destroy like the lives that he took. He felt resentment and sorrow and grief. With a long, musky wheeze, he let out one simple reply. I was never a good conductor.